March 12, 1945. The air was thick with uncertainty as hundreds of German prisoners stepped onto American soil for the first time, their boots scraping against a dock they had only seen in enemy propaganda. They had crossed the Atlantic not as conquerors, but as captives. Most believed this journey marked the final humiliation of a defeated army. Few expected mercy. Fewer still imagined comfort. None believed that some of them would one day refuse to leave. By the final year of the Second World War, Germany's military collapse was no longer theoretical. Entire divisions had vanished on the Eastern Front. Cities lay flattened under Allied bombing, and tens of thousands of German soldiers now found themselves alive only because they had surrendered. The United States faced an unexpected dilemma. By 1945, American forces had captured more Axis prisoners than any nation in history. Britain was overwhelmed. France was shattered. So Washington made a decision that would quietly reshape thousands of lives. German prisoners would be sent across the ocean, not to punishment camps, but to America itself. Between 1942 and 1946, nearly 400,000 German POWs were transported to the United States. They arrived convinced they would be beaten, starved, or worked to death. What awaited them instead was something they were never prepared to understand. The roots of that misunderstanding began long before capture. Nazi indoctrination had painted America as a land of racial chaos, moral decay, and brutal capitalism. Soldiers were told that surrender to Americans meant humiliation at best, execution at worst. The fear was so deeply embedded that many German units fought to the last bullet rather than give up. When surrender finally came, it often came suddenly. A white flag raised under artillery smoke. Hands lifted, trembling. A silence filled with dread as American soldiers approached. The first surprise came quickly. No beatings followed. No screaming guards. Instead, cigarettes were offered. Water canteens passed. Medical care given. One captured Oberschreiter later recalled his disbelief. They spoke calmly. They treated us like men. I kept waiting for the punishment. It never came. From temporary cages in France and North Africa, the prisoners were moved to ports. They were loaded onto transport ships under heavy guard, unsure if they were being taken to labor camps or mass graves. Weeks later, the ships docked in places they had only heard of in films and radio broadcasts. New York, Norfolk, New Orleans. The camps that awaited them were scattered across the country. Texas, Arizona, Kansas, Iowa, Michigan. Some were built on old Army training grounds. Others near farmland desperate for labor. Each camp was surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, but inside, life defied expectation. The Geneva Convention governed every detail. The United States followed it meticulously. Prisoners were housed in barracks with beds, blankets, and heating. They received 3 meals a day, often more nutritious than what civilians in Germany were surviving on. Bread was plentiful. Meat was regular. Coffee, Real coffee, became a symbol of abundance. For men who had endured hunger, cold, and endless retreat, the contrast was staggering. One former Wehrmacht corporal would later say, "I was better fed as a prisoner than I had been as a soldier." The realization brought confusion and shame. Work was optional, but most volunteered. Under the convention, POWs could be employed in non-military labor. American farms needed hands. Railways needed repairs. Lumber camps needed workers. German prisoners harvested cotton in the South, picked sugar beets in the Midwest, cut timber in the Pacific Northwest. They were paid a small wage, credited to camp accounts, and allowed to buy items from camp canteens. The work details changed everything. Beyond the fences, they encountered ordinary Americans. Farmers who spoke plainly. Children who waved. Women who offered lemonade. In Texas, one POW detail worked on a ranch owned by a widowed woman whose sons were fighting in Europe. She treated the prisoners firmly, but fairly. At the end of the season, she cooked them a farewell meal. One prisoner wrote in his diary that night, "She lost sons to this war, and still fed us." The ideology he had been raised with began to crack. Inside the camps, education programs flourished. The U.S. Army encouraged re-education, determined to dismantle Nazi beliefs. Libraries were stocked with banned books. Classes on democracy, history, and ethics were quietly introduced. At first, many resisted. Hardcore Nazis formed secret groups, intimidating others. Some prisoners refused to attend classes, calling them propaganda. But isolation weakened extremism. The war news grew worse. Letters from home described bombed cities and vanished families. Slowly, the authority of Nazi ideology collapsed. Men began to talk honestly for the first time. They spoke about guilt, responsibility, and the future. Conversations stretched late into the night. What happens when this ends? Is there anything left to return to? No one had answers. By late 1945, Germany was no longer a nation in the way they had known it. It was an occupation zone, a landscape of ruins, a people divided and starving. The prisoners learned these facts through newspapers and Red Cross reports. They saw photographs of Berlin reduced to rubble, Hamburg burned, Dresden erased. One former sergeant stared at a photo for several minutes before speaking. My mother's house was there. No one asked if it still stood. Meanwhile, life in the camps continued with order and predictability. There was food every day, medical care when needed, no bombs, no sirens, no death marches. Some prisoners were allowed to attend church services with local congregations. Others played soccer against American teams. Music groups formed. Theaters staged plays. The contrast between captivity and homeland grew unbearable. For many, America no longer felt like the enemy. It felt like stability. Personal bonds deepened the conflict. Friendships formed with guards who shared cigarettes and stories. Farm families invited work crews back year after year. In several states, prisoners learned English fluently. They read American newspapers. They listened to jazz and swing on radios. One Bavarian private later admitted, "I understood freedom first as a prisoner." The statement haunted him. When Germany formally surrendered in May 1945, celebrations erupted across the camps. The war was over. Home was supposed to be next. But the announcement did not bring joy to everyone. Instead, it brought dread. Repatriation plans were announced gradually. POWs would be returned in phases, depending on transport availability and labor needs. Many were scheduled for months of additional work before departure. During this period, an unspoken fear spread. Men who had once begged to go home now avoided the subject. They asked guards quiet questions. What will Germany be like? Is there work? Is there food? The answers were rarely reassuring. In some camps, morale collapsed. Men grew withdrawn. Others grew angry. A group of prisoners in Oklahoma wrote a petition, not demanding freedom, but asking to stay longer. The camp commandant was stunned. By 1946, the phenomenon could no longer be ignored. Thousands of German POWs were resisting repatriation, quietly, legally, emotionally. Some claimed medical issues. Others volunteered for every possible work extension. A few spoke openly. One former Luftwaffe mechanic said, "If I return, I will starve. Here I am alive." The logic was impossible to dismiss. The U.S. Army had no legal authority to keep them indefinitely. Prisoner status could not continue once repatriation was available. But the men were not wrong. Germany in 1946 was devastated. Food rationing was severe. Housing was scarce. Employment nearly non-existent. American camps, by contrast, offered order and dignity, even behind wire. For men stripped of everything else, that mattered more than freedom. Eventually, transports resumed. Trains carried prisoners to ports. Ships crossed the Atlantic once more, this time eastward. Departures were quiet. No cheering. No speeches. Some prisoners wept openly as the camps disappeared behind them. Guards watched in silence, unsure how to process the reversal of roles. Enemies had become something else, not friends, but witnesses to one another's humanity. Back in Germany, the reality matched the fear. Cities lay broken. Families were missing. Food lines stretched for hours. Many former POWs struggled to adapt. They carried memories of America that felt unreal against the ruins around them. Some were accused of having it easy during the war. Few spoke about their time openly. Yet the connection endured. In the late 1940s and 1950s, thousands of former German POWs applied to immigrate to the United States. They sought farm work, factory jobs, construction. Some succeeded. Many did not. Those who returned often settled near the towns where they had once been held. They married. They raised families. They became citizens. When asked years later why they came back, their answers were strikingly consistent. Because I was treated like a human being. Because I learned who I could be. Because this place showed me another way to live. The refusal to leave had never been about captivity. It had been about contrast. America had represented an interruption, a pause in violence that allowed reflection. Behind barbed wire, men confronted truths they had avoided as soldiers. They saw what restraint looked like, what accountability felt like. The irony was impossible to escape. An enemy nation had offered safety. A defeated homeland offered only survival. By the time the last German POWs left American soil in 1946, the phenomenon was already fading into history. No grand headlines recorded it. No monuments marked it. Yet its legacy endured quietly, in citizenship records, family names, and memories passed down. The men who refused to leave were not traitors. They were not cowards. They were survivors who had glimpsed a different future. World War II ended with victory and defeat measured in territory and treaties. But for these men, the war ended with a realization far more unsettling. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon is not force, but mercy.